Good afternoon. Welcome to our final weekly lecture. Will not be a lecture next week. I will have some additional lecture notes on the website, excuse me, on Campus Web that you can refer to. As you know or should know, I'll repeat, there is no written assignment due next week, but there are two cases for forum discussion, and I ask that you read those and respond to them, and then respond to other students' posts as you have done throughout the course. And I appreciate you doing that and interacting with your fellow students. It really helps move the course along. I'm going to talk a little bit this evening about your interview, which if you haven't started, you need to start pretty quickly because that interview is due. That's the final assignment. That's due on March the 1st by, pardon me, 11:50 p.m. Eastern Time. Need to be uploaded to Campus Web and the coursework assignments page. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're also going to talk about interviews in general. That focus will be more on selection interviews. Now, we've talked a little bit about selection a couple of weeks ago, and we talked a little bit about interviews a couple of weeks ago, but we're going to do that a little bit more in depth tonight. The interview is the most common quote-unquote test that HR folks and hiring managers do when they have a applicant and then eventually a candidate before them for a prospective open position. Pardon me. So your assignment for week 7, or for the assignment number 7, excuse me, which is due to week 8, Sunday the 1st, is to interview an HR professional, human resource manager, director, or senior analyst, and inquire about their interview methods, restrictions and prohibitions. Interview methods refer to how job candidates are questioned, and this is how the HR folks in that particular company question prospective applicants and then eventually prospective candidates in regards to the open position, and trying to find something out about the candidate and how well he or she, how much, let me change that around, how much experience he or she has for the position in question, and then what kind of a fit they are. Because I think that really, we talked before, and we have talked in this course several times, that organizations look for a person job fit or a person organization fit. And I really like to think it's a combination of both. One may take a precedence over the other, but if you hire a person for a position and you really don't think that person is well suited to the organization, you shouldn't be hiring that person. That a little seeded out in your mind, say, well, yeah, he or she can do this job, but wait a minute, I don't know how they're going to fit in here. So you really ought to think long and hard about this. I think it's a combination of both. And as I said before, one may take precedence over the other, but I think they kind of, pardon me, again, go together. What restrictions the organization places on those conducting a job interview, and what prohibitions it has regarding the type of questions asked. You probably say to yourself, well, restrictions and prohibitions are really the same type of thing, and they have the same meaning, but they're actually somewhat different, at least as far as I'm concerned. For instance, restrictions could refer to the type of questions not asked. You cannot ask this question. What's the purpose of an employment interview? In reality, it is an exchange of information while the interviewer is trying to find out as much about the individual who is being interviewed. And this person at this particular time, let's take this person as being a candidate. By the same token, the person being interviewed is trying to find out as much about the company as he or she possibly can. Now, since the things have changed today, and we have this wide application to the wide application's not the right word. We can get into the internet anytime we want. We can find out about the companies. What we're finding today is that many prospective employees, candidates, come to this the hiring interview, if you will, knowing a lot about the company because they've gone to the internet and done a little research. Perhaps they've asked friends that work at the company or somebody else who has a relationship with the company, like a salesperson or someone of that nature. So they have a lot of information. The interviewer provides information about the organization, and then they ask questions to determine if the potential employee is either a good fit for the open position or a good fit for the organization. And this is repeating what we said before, but this is doing it from the interviewer's perspective. And so we need to look at this not differently, but understanding that as we go through this entire process, there are people making value judgments at every step along the process and keeping these things in mind. So when you get to the interviewer, the final interviewer, if you will, or set of interviewers, or panel, if set up that way. That's a critical piece of information. The interviewee, as we mentioned, has a different perspective. He or she's trying to find out as much about the company as he or she possibly can. And as I said before, probably comes to the interview well prepared, understands about the company, but now he or she's trying to get into the finer points, whatever those might happen to be. According to the authors of our text, Carruth, and Payne, the interview has 3 objectives. First is gathering information, and we're going to put some slides up here in a few minutes that's going to say the same thing. Yes, the potential employee has completed an application and perhaps provided a resume, but those don't really paint a complete picture. Now, because the picture is incomplete, the interview is a probing exercise, my term, designed to fill in the blanks and bring clarity to the information provided. You can see this in the text on pages 204 and 205. Second, as mentioned above, the interviewer provides information about the organization, usually a general sketch. And again, like I said, the interviewee comes, and if he or she wants the job, they're usually well prepared. That person is usually well prepared because they've gathered pertinent research about the company. Interviewer also provides information about working hours, working conditions, salary, benefits, etc., and then perhaps other specific job-related information. It's important that the information given be accurate and the potential candidate receives what is known as a realistic job preview, RJP. Now, we have touched on realistic job previews, especially when we were talking about recruiting and specifically people who go out and recruit. We can think of these as being campus recruiters. We can think of them as being job fair recruiters. Maybe it's the same person, but where the recruiting is in a different atmosphere. And it's very important that the person who is either an applicant or a potential applicant at the job fairs and college recruiting and high school recruiting, et cetera, or vocational recruiting, vocational school recruiting. It's important that they provide an RJP, but it's doubly important that the interviewer provide it at this particular time. And Ivancovich, in his Human Resource Management 9th edition, published in 2004, says a traditional job preview paints a rosy picture, when that may not be the case, whereas a realistic job preview sets expectations in a positive, unvarnished manner. And RJP usually leads to high job satisfaction and lower turnover. That's a big issue for companies. And so the realistic job preview is not saying to bring out the dirty linen and things of that nature, but it's to tell people what to expect on the job. Now, we talked before here a week or so ago about orientation, and then orienting individual to being two-faced as far as I'm concerned, company orientation, which is the big picture, completing the necessary forms and stuff, things of that nature, but also getting some indoctrination to the company. And then the employee is indoctrinated, oriented to his specific or her specific department and job. And not only shown where he or she's going to work, but relationships with other employees in the same department, etc. And all along the line, there should be reinforcement of this realistic job preview and letting employees know what to expect and things of that nature, so that when something comes up that maybe is a little out of the ordinary, it's, oh yeah, I was told about that, so I know how to handle that. So you don't want to paint a picture that, hey, everything, this is great and nothing bad ever happens here, etc., because, pardon me, that's just not true. We're humans. We make mistakes all the time. We have things that are sent to us that are not properly constructed, if you will, and so the employee needs to understand that. Third is to leave the applicant, now in this particular case, I should say candidate, with a positive view of the company. And that just follows along with the RJP. If the candidate is not selected, but has the skills that could be used in another position, you don't want him or her to leave with a bad impression. You would like that person to consider applying again, but he or she won't if the interview is conducted poorly. Now remember, if you go back to the case we worked last week, I believe it was, about Sheila, I don't remember her last name, was the department chief, and she was called by the HR guy, Pete, and said, I think I have the ideal candidate for you, and I'd like for you to interview him now. And she said, oh, gee, I'm not so sure. I'm kind of busy, tied up. And we don't really know from the case whether he pressed her or not. But she acquiesced to hold the interview. And Alan came up. And then, as we know, she was interrupted. The interview was interrupted by phone calls and people coming in from the department saying, we've got this crisis that has to be fixed, and that crisis has to be fixed, and something else has to be fixed. So we know that later on in the case, while Sheila's on the phone again, she asked Alan to call her back later in the day, so set up an appointment where they can talk at greater length. What's he going to do? He probably is going to say, I don't think I want to work there. They don't seem like they're very well organized. When in fact, Sheila may be the most organized person in the world, but she has a bunch of fires to put out that were unexpected, and she compounded the issue by one, agreeing to meet with Alan, and then two, once she agreed to meet with him, she didn't clear her desk, say, hold my phone calls, tell people I don't need to be interrupted for the next 30 minutes or whatever happens to be. So we cannot expect, at least I couldn't expect Alan to come back and meet with her again, unless he really wants the job and he knows enough about the company that he thinks he can make do. But certainly a bad impression has been left in his mind. I'm going to put some slides up now. And we know here, we've talked about this before, that interviewing is the most frequently used selection method. And we don't need to talk about that too much more than that. And we sort of set the stage for this. But it is very important because we have some problems with interviewing in a way that we have to make sure that the selection method we use, remember, interviewing is the most often used selection method. We have to make sure that it's both reliable and valid. Reliable means that you're going to get the same results or very similar results time after time after time after time. And valid means it relates to the test is actually, and this is what the interview is considered to be, is actually measuring what it's supposed to measure. So there's some real difficulties in making sure that the interview is set up in such a way that it's going to meet both those criteria, validity and reliability. So what you want to do is, or what I suggest that you do, not necessarily that you have to do, is ask the organization, common methods used, testing, etc. Ask the organization if they use either a structured interview or a non-structured interview, and why they use what they use. I'm going to try to get this slide down here so we can see what we want to about the interview process, but it's not right now. It's not cooperating with me real well. I'm having a very difficult time with this, with the slides tonight, and I apologize for that. I've had some technical issues, and I can't explain exactly why we're getting what we're getting, but we are. I'm going to get out of this for the time being and see if we can fix this and get to where we want to be. But if not, I'll do this without. I'd like to have that slide up for you to see, but evidently it's not going to work. And I apologize for that, but I'm not going to go any further in body. So we'll just talk about these over the top. The structured interview is simply this: are all applicants, candidates now, ask the same questions? I want to let you know that the questions don't have to be asked in the same sequence, but that they're all asked the same questions. It's a structured interview. If the answer is no, then we should ask why not. And what do the HR folks see as the benefit of not using a structured format? Is the organization looking for free-flowing answers, responses? That's the object of a unstructured format. If so, does it have some way of measuring answers when they don't use a structured format? Now, you can look up on page 210 in your text. I'll get to that also a little bit later. And there's some idea of how to follow the structured format, the unstructured format. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but 210 is a good place to start. Gives you some kind of an idea of what that format is. Ivancovich says that the structured interviews are either behavioral descriptor interviews, BDIs, or situational interviews. The BDI, behavioral description interview, asks the candidates to relate actual incidents from their past relevant work experience as it applies to the current job they're seeking. BDI is based upon the assumption that past experience is a good predictor of future performance. An example of this type of structure interview would be, in your last job, how did you resolve a conflict between subordinates or between a customer and an employee? After receiving the response, the interviewer would follow up with, was the conflict resolved to each party's satisfaction? Did you have a sense of accomplishment in resolving the conflict, or were you frustrated? Ivancovich follows up that by talking about the situational interview, also known as an SI, asked to identify if the candidate has the needed skills to perform the job duties and if he or she is motivated to do the job. This is similar to an applicant's can-do and will-do abilities, but the situational interview uses a different tactic. Here, this uses a hypothetical scenario that the candidate might encounter on the job. For example, a customer might ask a salesperson to provide information about a particular product that is not currently available to the general public. So the interviewer might ask, what research would you conduct to get the information to the customer? And responses are then scored according to how they dovetail with the job for which the interviewer, for which the interview is being conducted, or more appropriately, to which the candidate is being interviewed. Ivancovich continues by saying the research on situational interviews shows that asking questions based on it is a more valid and better predictor of job success than using future-oriented questions. So he's saying here this is more grounded in reality and gives us a better prediction of what we can expect. This does not mean that future-oriented questions should not be used. Rather, they must be carefully crafted so the responses can be given adequate. So the responses can be adequately assessed. Now, I'm going to try one more time to get this up about the structured interview and see if we can do it this way. And if I can't, then I'll just refer to my notes. Not the best way to do this, and I apologize to get what we're looking for. I keep coming up with the interview, and there are more slides available here, but I cannot, for some reason, get to where I want to be with them. All right, we're just going to have to skip that. I'm going to have to figure out what the problem is, and I can only apologize. There's some information that we might be able to use here, but someone in the organization, whether it's the hiring manager or someone in the HR department or a combination of people from there, needs to prepare and conduct a structured interview. Now, we're on a structured part. We'll get to the unstructured part in a few minutes. It is essential that the interviewer be familiar with the open position. So most likely you're going to have the hiring manager there. He or she may be accompanied by someone from HR and may not be accompanied from someone by HR. And if it's not somebody from the hiring manager, there's someone else there, or there's a panel, if you will, the people sitting on the panel, or whoever this other interviewer is, if the hiring manager is not there, need to be aware of what's required for this job. And if they're not, then they shouldn't be conducting the interview. Regardless of whether the interviewer is a human resources professional or it's someone else, that Stewart and Brown state the interviewer must do the following. He or she must determine how to and what to measure in the interview or from the results of the interview. So they should start with a job analysis. Whoever the interviewer is, and let's for the sake of debate here, let's say the interviewer is the hiring manager. He or she should start with a job analysis to assure that he is or she is conversant with the knowledge, skills, and abilities and other characteristics the position requires. Now, the hiring manager should be, but there's always the potential that he is not as, I'm going to use the term technically competent as the person who is being considered for the position. He or she should determine what separates a top performer from the rest. So what you're saying here is to yourself as you're kind of developing these questions is, what do I expect from a top performer? And so I know my top performer in my department or division or office, I know what he or she does. And so I'm going to set that not necessarily as my benchmark, but I'm going to set that as my high expectations. Then I might use somebody else in the department who is at a minimum, at least a satisfactory performer. And that will be my benchmark. So the person must at least reach that level. I know what that person does and how that person does. And the questions I'm developing should bring that out. Pardon me. And so there's some variance between the satisfactory performer and the performer who is at the top. And then we need to ensure that the questions developed are appropriate for the job. That is, that they're job related. Now remember, that interview is considered a test. And the Supreme Court has made several decisions, Griggs versus Duke Power 1, and there have been several others. It says any test must be job related. And that was part of the problem with Griggs, as you remember, that Griggs was being tested on things that weren't job related. And then, of course, the questions developed meet legal requirements. So if you, Mr. or Miss Hiring Manager, is developing this interview and the questions, then you need to pass those off to the HR folks to have them look at it to make sure you're not asking anything that's not appropriate. The second step here is, while we're thinking about all this stuff, and the second step is action, and that is writing the questions. So you want to meet with others who will be doing follow-up interviews and agree on questions to be asked. Now, if in fact there is not to be a follow-up interview, then you still want to meet with people to make sure that the questions you're asking are the correct questions. We talked about this before, but here you're doing the writing. So you want to make sure that you're writing what you want, etc. Do you want to create either behavioral or situational questions, or you could do a combination of both. Now, when it talks about that remember, that's talking about what you think this person is going to be able to do. Past performance is a predictor of future, past experience is a predictor of future performance. So you're obviously going to ask some questions that are generic. You're going to ask for some experience questions, etc. And then you want to take that to the next step. Ensure the questions, again, are appropriate and they meet legal requirements. Then finally, you want to design something. Stewart and Brown say a form. It doesn't have to be a form, but that's probably the best way to approach it. That will evaluate or help you evaluate the answers. And then you should develop typical responses for the questions you have, and have a range of poor to satisfactory or average, however you want to say that, to good. Now you could have some intermediate steps in there if you want, and that's okay. And then, of course, you're assuring that people agree on those answers of not very good, average, or satisfactory, and then good. And then ensure that each interviewer, if there's more than one, reviews that range and agrees with the assigned ranges and the potential scores. So let's just go back to not very good or poor, and actually, as Stewart and Brown say, and then average or satisfactory and good. And you should be a range. So your range might want to be something like 1 for a not very good response, 2 or 3 for an average satisfactory response, and 5 for what you consider to be a very good response. And remember, I said that there could be intervening scores in there to help you along the way to determine what it is that you want to be. And for instance, here, we'll give you some ideas. A behavioral question, you might ask an applicant to describe actions in a particular past situation. We've talked before. And it's often, you have to work together in a group to accomplish a task. Tell me about the most recent experience you have with working in a group. And a sample poor response would be lots of conflict. The other members were ineffective. Now, here the candidate is placing blame on other people who are not there to defend themselves. An average response would be, I did all the work myself. Now, I would think that would not be a very good response, period, because this person is working in a group or in a team, and there should be some synergy there to get things going and moving in a positive direction. And then Stewart and Brown give us a superior response would be, we'll work together. I helped involve everyone. That's kind of, those responses are really kind of, what I want to say is really not definitive, but you can see how they progress from not being very good to moving up. Now, a situational would be, customer comes in your store and comes in to pick up a watch that he left off for repair. And it was supposed to have been ready a week or so ago. But the watch is not back from the repair shop, and the customer's angry, so how would you handle the situation? And a poor response would be, tell him that you'll check, and I'll tell him to check, and I'll contact you later. An average response would be, apologize, tell him I'll call him later. And I really don't think that's even a good response. Apologize, say, I'll contact the repair shop and find out what the issue is, and I'll call you as soon as I possibly can. A superior response would be, listen, obviously you must do that. Try to put the person at ease, and then call the repair shop while he is there or she is there waiting. So you can see, or that person can see by your body language as well as listening to one of the conversation what's going on. And of course, it could be that more parts were needed to repair the watch or something else, and those were ordered, but they didn't come in, et cetera. So there are a lot of possible answers here, but we need to make sure that we give the customer the right possible answer. Excuse me just a minute. I've been suffering from a stuffed up nose. I don't have any symptoms of a cold for some period of time. Thank you. Now, the second type of interview, we've talked about this before, is the unstructured interview. And we need to look at it a little more in detail. I do have a slide, but as you know, I'm unable to get the slide to come up, and that's a technical issue. I need to get to the technical folks and find out what it is. The text authors, we're talking here about Carruth, Cruz, and Payne, state that this is a comprehensive interview. Now, I don't really like to challenge authors of textbooks because most of them have expertise that I don't possess. But unless the person conducting this type of interview is well schooled in doing this, I don't see how it could be a comprehensive interview. A person conducting a comprehensive interview tries to ask a question and probes for additional answers. And if he or she is not well schooled in that, it's kind of like the person being a focus group leader. Focus group leader knows how to probe to get more out of answers. But if you're not schooled in that, you don't understand that dynamic, if you will, you're not going to get all the answers that you want. And I don't see how it can be comprehensive. But as I say, that's what the authors say. The sole purpose, and I said that, and I'm probably going to change that a little bit, but the major purpose, so I'm going to say the major purpose, not sole purpose. The major purpose of this type of interview is to keep the candidate talking. And so by doing that, by asking, if you get a response and then you come back with a probing question, and that's asking for the person the interviewee to expand or expound upon what he or she just said. And additional information comes up after the first response. Give as much learning so you can learn as much as possible about the person. But again, as I say, the person who is conducting this type of interview needs to be very skilled in doing it. Otherwise, he or she is not going to get what they're looking for. The authors provide a list of questions used in a non-structured format on page 210 in the text. And I was going to refer to that a second and bring some of them up to you. Tell me about yourself. Why did you leave your present job? What are your primary strengths, your primary weaknesses, etc.? And then they're asking here, there's one question, describe the worst boss you ever had. Why do you think this person was a bad boss? Now, you can take all of those questions and continue to probe for further answers, for expansion on what was said, etc. The problem that you have, at least that I have in thinking about this, is how do you score that? How do you say what's a good answer, what's a bad answer, what's an average answer? I don't think that there's a way. You can't quantify that. And so what you have here is you have a qualitative interview, which could be good, but you have no way to measure the responses. You can think about them, and perhaps if using that one question there that I brought out of the text, who was the worst boss you ever worked for, a bad boss, and why do you think made him a bad boss? Now, you could probably, if you did some research, maybe perhaps through the Society of Human Resource Management or someone else, and they usually have things that these are bad bosses and these are good bosses, and people are oriented to, employee oriented, or they're not, et cetera, et cetera. And so you could make a case one way or another. But unless you come up with that answer, that you have saying, okay, this is a typical answer here, then you probably aren't going to be able to do that very well. This type of interview has a whole bunch of negatives or disadvantages, whatever you want to say. The first being that a better composed candidate who speaks well, who has a high verbal capacity, will likely have a better result. And I think if we stop and think through what was just mentioned here, we can see that. A person's well at ease, speaks well, has or she speaks well, has a great vocabulary, can pick things up and put them in the right context and things of that nature, uh, obviously they're going to have a better chance. Second, as I've mentioned previously, ranking these candidates through an unstructured interview is very subjective, in that, among other things, the interviewer may be influenced by someone's command of the language, that we just talked about before, among other things, and perhaps by that person's dress. Now, there is and when you look at this type of interview, and it probably even extends to the structured interview, there is this thing, and I'm sorry I don't have it with me, in a human resource management text I used a number of years ago, written by Gary Dessler, talked about first-person bias. And that is that if the first person interviewed comes in and blows away the interviewer by his or her composure, language, speaking skills, verbal skills, etc., and he or she is well dressed, it's almost impossible for any subsequent candidate to overcome what's known as first-person bias. You're blown away by this person, and anybody who comes in after that is being measured against that first person usually will not measure up. In this case, the better speaker, well-dressed candidate will be selected when he or she may not be the best candidate. Third, the type of interview has very low reliability, not easy for me to get out for some reason, and validity, and it may be difficult to defend in case of legal action. So we need to stop and think about that and say, well, what's going on here? What can we do? How can we defend it? So you really need to have some way of measuring what's given up to you. And I'm going to, at the end of tonight, we're going to take a break here in just a couple of minutes, and I'll come back and then we'll finish up what I have. And then I'll have some summaries about interviews, or summarize this about interviews with some research work that's been done and some more information from Stewart and Brown to put a lot of this interview business in perspective. So regardless of the type of interview, structured or non-structured, used, Ivancovich says that the job interview is a conversation between two people that has a specific purpose. We talked about this before, exchange of information. Here the interviewer and the applicant trying to determine if there's a fit. Fit can be between the interviewee and the job, or between the interviewee and the organization. So ask the person that you interview whether his or her organization uses the job fit or organization fit approach. Follow that answer by asking why the organization chooses one over the other. Now, we've reached 5:15. We've been at this for 45 minutes. I'd like to take a break here. We'll take about a 10-minute break, and please come back at 5:25, and then we'll finish this up. I have a couple more pages, and I want to give the wrap-up that comes from Stewart and Brown, and then some research data that I have dug up, which I think will be very interesting for you as you're into your process of conducting an interview. I want you to remember your interview is probably going to be unstructured, although I urge you to go in with and I'll talk about this later, with a written set of questions so you can follow those along. Thank you. Please come back at 5:25. All right, we're back. You want to ask, or you want to find out, how the organization arrives at its hiring decision. Is it based upon the interview responses, knowledge, skills, experience, abilities, and other characteristics, including education, or some other factors? Is there testing involved with this? Does personal appearance and good communication skills factor into the hiring decision? Now, of course, in some cases, it should those should do that. The person who's a customer service representative, for instance, you want that person to have good speaking skills. Think of the number of times that you have called for customer service and you've been routed to a place outside the continental United States. For instance, a number of calls will go to India, and some go to the Philippines. Reasons that they go to those countries is because they have good language skills and they can speak English. In the case of India, the folks from India don't speak American English, they speak British English. Or maybe United Kingdom English is a better way to say that. And people get frustrated because they don't understand what they're saying. I get terribly frustrated because, as you may know, I don't hear well. Even though I wear hearing aids, I still don't hear well. And it's very frustrating for me to do that. So obviously, if you had somebody that you're interviewing for that position, you want them to have good language skills. Are the interviewers trained to look for nonverbal cues and clues? How do interviewers overcome first impression bias, which I mentioned toward the end of the last hour? This is a list of sample questions, and you might want to add your own. And I encourage you to do so. prohibited questions that we talked about earlier generally fall into categories of those that may get the employer in trouble. Those including questions about race, marital status, religion, age, etc. Remember, there's another prohibited question. That is, have you ever been arrested? You cannot ask that question because arrest does not necessarily mean conviction. And of course, some may say, well, yeah, I was arrested for a minor traffic violation. I went to court and I paid the fine. That's not a felony. You can ask if a person has been arrested. You can ask if a person has been convicted of a felony. We talked about that several weeks ago. You're probably not going to ask the person you interview about that, whether they ask those questions or not, but you certainly can. Some of those questions may seem innocuous, but if a person who did not get the position complained to the EEOC, and he or she could show bias, that would cause the entire selection process to become null and void. Even though you may know the answer, ask the person being interviewed if there are prohibited questions. The text provides a sample list of prohibited questions on page 224. In this interview that you're going through, now this is a cautionary word for me, not something that you would necessarily violate, just cautionary. You don't want to probe too far. If you find resistance, you can maybe ask another question to get something there, but if you get resistance again, stop and just move on. So in preparing for the interview, you want to ask yourself some questions, such as, where do I begin? Obviously at the beginning, but there's other ways to do that. What questions are the most important? And are there any questions I should avoid? The important questions should be asked first, because that sets the tone and keeps the person you're interviewing engaged. You may want to say focused as well. The last thing you want to do is get into an interview and somehow, some way, turn the interviewer off, or ask a question that has no bearing, and the interviewer says, well, this is frivolous. I don't care about this. This is a waste of my time. That's why we want to ask the important questions first. After you complete the self-examination, prepare the list of questions you want to ask. I heartily suggest, recommend that you use the text to help in constructing the questions. You may want to ask for some assistance from a friend. You may want to have a friend or a trusted person look over your list to make sure that you're not stepping on somebody's toes. So review it. After you prepare it, review it and make sure it contains all the questions that you want to ask. You're not going to have the opportunity to think about, oh, hey, wait a minute, I want to ask this question, and where do I fit it in? Now, I say you're not going to have the opportunity. You say, well, yeah, wait a minute, that comes up. Well, it probably will, but you're not going to be able to ask the question the way you want to ask it because you've not prepared to ask the question. I don't think we should ever, I mentioned before, this is somewhat of an unstructured interview, and it is in some respects, but it should be more structured. You don't have to put down quality of responses and grade them and things of that nature. You're not trying to do that. But you are trying to get quality answers, and then get those answers to compare and contrast those to what has been presented in the text and what we presented in these lectures. So you can see whether the company is doing things or not. Now, I had a student several years ago who actually went to the text and used the text to frame his questions. And then when he went to talk to the human resource person at his company, he sort of said something like, well, this is the best practice that we found out in our in the text that we use in the course I took. Do you follow these practices? And then try to get the person to expound upon it. You don't have to do that, but that turned out to be a very effective interview. So make sure you have all the questions you want to ask. It's important because thinking of questions on the spur of the moment, now this, I'm repeating myself, but I want to do it for emphasis, it's not a good tactic. You may not frame it correctly. You may not ask it the way it ought to be asked. You may fumble it. All those things. And it's just, the unstructured interview format. I like to think that the person who's conducting that, and this is what you would be doing if you went to unstructured, I like to think that person thinks that he or she is smarter smarter than the average bear. And in fact of the matter is that person might be, but most of us aren't that good. And the reason we're not that good is because we've not gone through this process all the time. And we've not conducted interview after interview after interview after interview. If you have, fine. And then share your success with the rest of us. I would like to learn as much as your fellow students would. But ordinarily speaking, I found that most students have not done interviews extensively, and so it's best to go in with a structured script. Try to gain as much information as possible and clarify the answers you receive. You want to do this by what is known as active listening, and then you want to paraphrase what the person said, and you just go back to the person and say, I understood you to say X, Y, Z. And then that will show the person that you're paying attention to his or her answers, that you're engaged, that you're really listening to what was being said and not just taking something and writing it down and going on to the next question. And you're going to get a really well-developed answer after that. This paraphrasing accomplishes two things. It demonstrates the person you're interviewing that you're paying attention, as I said. And second, it gives the interviewee a chance to elaborate on the original question. It gives them time to think, and then they can elaborate on the original answer. It gives them time to think, and they can go back and do some reformulation. An effective way to conduct an interview is to ask if the organization uses techniques pointed out in the text. This is what I mentioned before that a former student did. This also helps you stay on track. If you use the text to prepare your questions. The responses given should give you an idea of whether or not the organization follows what is presented in the text or a similar type text. Text presents an overview of generally accepted practices, and most organizations follow them to some extent, not completely to the letter of the law, etc. Asking questions you gather from the text helps you because it helps you rethink about what you've learned, and it helps you perhaps in framing the questions. Hey, we saw this, we did this, we discussed this in a forum discussion. We heard this from the instructor during a live lecture, and so we want to follow up with that. It is critical that you control the interview, as you don't want the person being interviewed to wander off into some tangent that turns out to be meaningless, and you really don't care about that. It's not going to help your interview one way or the other. You may want to put some of your personality into the questions. For instance, you may remember questions from your job interview that you liked or did not, and find out if that organization, the person that you're interviewing, if that person in that organization uses that question or one that's similar to it, and why. As we stated earlier, it's important to get as much information as possible, but it's also important to record the responses as quickly as you can. You want to jot down the pertinent facts, which will help develop the salient pieces of the responses later to help you remember them. If the person being interviewed states that some information is confidential, don't go any further. Let the person being interviewed know that you're asking questions as part of for an assignment for your course, and that all responses will be kept confidential. I don't share responses with anybody. If the person asks that the company's name not be used, that's fine. It would be nice to know the type of business the company's in, but that's not necessary. So after you've completed the interview, prepare a critical summary of the information obtained and compare and contrast that information to the interviewing, selecting, and staffing concepts presented in the text, and your work should be approximately 12 to 15 pages. Now, let's do a little bit on structured and unstructured here as a wrap up to what we have. We'll spend about 10 minutes here doing that, maybe a little bit less, and then we'll conclude for tonight. Structured interviews provide consistency. Each candidate is asked the same question, again, maybe not in the sequence, resulting in reduced interviewer bias. Each candidate is evaluated on the same criteria, which should ensure fairness of the interview process. It keeps the interviewer on track, and questions are strictly job-related. And it helps them focus and not to overlook important areas. Actually, structured interviews are very good if you get questions about hiring bias from minorities or women. Because you have a structured interview and you follow the same questions, there is the amount of bias is reduced. I won't say it's reduced to zero. I think that's probably pie in the sky, but it certainly is reduced to a minimal effect. Keeps the interview within legal compliance because discrimination is reduced, as I said before. I also had a note here that discriminatory questions are removed. There should never be a discriminatory question in any type of interview. And so, as we talked about before, once the questions are developed, they need to be passed through the HR folks to assure any discrimination, either overt or covert, is completely removed. Structured interviews are often designed and or approved by the HR folks. Yeah, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but they need to be in on the final say-so. Structured interviews allow interviewers to quickly determine the candidate's value and if he or she should move to the next round of interviews, assuming there is a next round, or that he or she should be considered in the final decision-making process. A structured interview is especially useful for initial and phone interviews. Remember, initial and phone interviews are normally screening out interviews. In these instances, it can be viewed as an exceptional weeding out tool. And I say that because, again, everybody would be asked the same questions, not necessarily the same sequence, but you wouldn't be saying, oh, well, Joe said this, but Sally said that, because you have the structured questions already there. Easy to compare results as each candidate is evaluated on the same criteria, and thus that increases interview fairness. Finally, it prevents the interviewer from getting into areas that are not job related. The unstructured, and I hope as we present this, you've made some mental notes, and you can see to do a comparison and contrast between the two approaches. This type may start with a prepared script, but once the ice is broken, the interviewer will home in on points of interest, usually points of his or her interest, where he or she wants to take the interview. The unstructured interview is used to examine relevant job issues that may not have been answered by the application or resume, or answered on the application or resume. An unstructured interview is a valuable tool for finding out more about the candidate and how he or she may react in a specific situation. The interviewer has the opportunity to explore statements that come up during the interview and move on them as well. And because it is less formal, the interviewer and the candidate may develop a rapport. Now, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, I'm not here to say. Obviously, you want the interview to be as, regardless of the type, although I lean towards structure, you want it to be as friendly as possible. There's some tension there. The interviewee is going to come in, he or she's going to be keyed up and may not do as well as they wanted to do. They're concerned, they want the job. Maybe not only want the job, they need the job. Or perhaps, let's say, not only want the job, but they want to work for the company, et cetera. So there's going to be some built-up tension. So you want to try to break that as much as possible. And what's said here is that the unstructured interview has a better way of doing that than the structured interview, but I think you could do that the same way with the other ones, just by taking a little bit of care and setting up the structured interview. I'm going to give you some research from several authors, Vandersea, Baker, and Baker, Baker A and Baker P, published the results of their research regarding structured versus unstructured interviews in an article titled, "Why Are Structured Interviews Rarely Used in Personnel Selection?" This article appeared in the Journal of Applied Psychology in 2002. The authors state there are several reasons why structured interviews are less popular. Let me turn my page here to get to you just a second here. Interviewers may not know of the academic research that supports the use of structured interviews. Some interviewers may be aware of the research but question its credibility. Structured interviews keep the interviewer hemmed in. This is why they don't use it, remember. Hemmed in, not allowing freedom, autonomy, and the need to exert influence, parenthesis, power, over the interviewees. Now, we have to stop and think about something here. The interview process is, as we said at the very beginning, an exchange of information. An exchange of information should be done between two equals, and in this particular case. And so there should be no power exerted over an individual. I can tell you, I was in an interview many years ago, and I'm just reflecting on this. And the person who conducted the interview really was coming from a power position. And I was uncomfortable in that interview. I was not offered a job, and I think had I been offered a job, I would have declined simply because of the atmosphere in the interview. Structured interviews are seen as boring. Well, they don't have to be. Unstructured interviews promote warmth and focus attention on the interviewee, not on the interview questions. You can still do that with a structured interview. And of course, this is absolutely kind of in a way in contrast to having to exert power over the interviewee. Structured interviews may seem as counter to the organization's philosophy. As a result, they're frowned upon. Now, what they're saying here is that the organization focuses on transparency and openness, open communication, etc. Then structure, following structure probably doesn't fit within their philosophy and guiding values, etc. So it's going to be looked at, we really don't want to do it this way. And then finally, according to the authors Vandersea, Baker, and Baker, interviewers may lack the sophistication and background to conduct a structured interview. That goes back to the statement that I made before, that people who like to do unstructured interviews believe that they're smarter than the average bear and that they can get more out of it by not following the script. And of course, I submit to you that, yes, there are people like that, but the vast majority of us don't fall into that category. We need some benchmark. We need something to fall back on, some good measurement tool. And remember, the interview is considered a test. And so if it is considered a test, there has to be some measurement associated with that test. It's very hard to measure in an unstructured interview. I assume that there is, for the sake of an argument, and we could see that there could be, but that kind of is counterbalanced to what they're doing. Stewart and Brown, in their Human Resource Management Linking Strategies to Practice text, published in the second edition, published in 2011, provide some interesting material about job interviews. One is that because the interviewee is trying to sell him or herself, the interviewer may not see the whole person. So think about this as a person who's on a sales pitch, and he or she is trying to sell a particular product or service. And the focus is not on the person, the focus is on the product and what the product or the service can do for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So some of what is being given might be hidden. Furthermore, the interviewer cannot assume that people who are good at making first impressions will be the best employees. That goes back and as a reaffirmation of what we talked about before, talking about first impression bias and things people about interviewees who have good speaking skills and high verbal skills. Some research contends that the interview is not a good way to select job applicants. It is neither reliable nor valid. However, recent research takes an opposite viewpoint. The information gathered during the interview cannot be obtained from any other job applicant test. That's true. You're not going to be able to get that. If they're going through a test, you're not going to be able to get that. If they're going through an in-basket exercise, you're not going to be able to get that. So if you're using other tests and they're required for the job and they're job related, as we talked about, remember they have to be job related, then, and of course so should the interview be, then you're going to get some information from those tests and the interview will flesh out the whole person. Interviews are time consuming and costly, no question about that. As a result, organizations should not interview candidates unless they have successfully passed through preliminary screenings. I think that's very important to follow. So if you look at our text, there was a primary screening and a secondary screening, and somewhere in that secondary screening stage, they may also be sent for testing, etc. So they should pass screening interview 1, screening interview 2, and the required test before they get to a candidacy interview, which is, you remember, stage 3. Otherwise, you're making a mistake. Now, sometimes that happens when there's a need to hire somebody in a hurry. A lot of times those decisions are faulty. So you really have to do everything you can to make sure you don't make a bad decision, because it's very costly to go start the recruiting and selection process over. Interviewers are biased and often make subjective judgment. Consider the conclusion reached by Siegrist, Sharon L. Siegrist Purkis, Pamela Puri, Trina L. Gillespie, Bronson T. Mays, and Gerald Ferris in their research published as Implicit Sources of Bias in Employment Interview Judgments and Decisions, published in Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processing, volume 101 in 2006, pages 152 to 167. The results of the present study indicate that, to a degree, interviewers are still allowing illegal and often irrelevant factors, such as the combined effects of ethnicity and accent, to affect judgments and decisions about job applicants. I would like to say that, this is a direct quote, but I would prefer that we would be using job candidates here as opposed to applicants. But as I said, this is a direct quote. Instead of focusing on job-related qualifications, the authors conclude, in essence, we are still judging the book by the cover rather than solely on the contents. Well, we have reached 5:52. We spent the last half an hour discussing the wrap-up of the interview. I would just offer you some final words about your interview. Please make sure that you're prepared for the interview. Make sure that you go in and put the person you're interviewing at ease. Ask the gut questions first. Now, yeah, you might want to find out some easy questions like how long the person's been employed there, and if maybe what their standing in HR is. Maybe they're an SPHR or PHR, professional human resources, or senior professional human resources. That's not necessary, but you may want to get that information. You may want to get some other, what we would call just general information. But you have a script, stick to your script, have some idea whether answers are good, bad, or indifferent. Use the text, as I mentioned before, to help you in setting this up. And be friendly. Try to conclude the interview on a high note. Remember, anything that's flagged as confidential or proprietary, you don't want to go there. And please put the interviewee at rest that you're only going to, that this is part of an assignment that you have, that any information that you gather will be kept confidential. And you have my assurance that I do not share this information with anyone. And again, it doesn't go anywhere. It comes to me, and then I'll respond to you, and that's the end of it. So I thank you for your attention this evening. I'd like to remind you there is no recorded lecture for next week. However, there are 2 case studies to work next week, as there are 2 case studies to work tonight. And please be as good as you have been in responding to your fellow students. That's a way that we all are. So I thank you for your attention for the last hour and a half, and good night.